Thank you, Greg. Okay, today we're going to hear from Jim Goche, tell you a little bit about him and what he's going to talk about. So, something a little different than we're used to, but it has to do with local community things. So, I'll tell you a little bit about background. Was the deputy prosecutor for Snohomish County. He was the executive director, senior staff lobbyist for several professional organizations like different counties and physicians groups. Senior hearing examiner for the state of Washington. He worked with ports of Olympia and Tacoma, the former Tacoma that is, to help to write its first strategic plan back in 1992-94. And in 94 to help it clean up Commencement Bay. Tell you what he's going to talk to us about, give us some information on. He's the manager of Friendly Grove Farm, which is a small family farm just north of Olympia, Lacey area that grows tree and vine fruit and row crops and nuts. He also, these are names that were given to him, I think, by his family and friends. He's also known as the Squash Wrangler, the Garlic Maven, and the Chestnut Reeve. He's fenced in half an acre, and 6 years ago teamed up with Kiwanis to grow food for the county food bank. The half acre hosts many volunteers during the growing season and provides 3 to 4 tons of fresh food for those in need. He's also an adjunct professor here at St. Martin's University, teaching law, philosophy, and senior seminar. Well, let's welcome Jim Goche.
Thank you. Bear with me just a minute and see if I can get the PowerPoint presentation working here on the computer.
I can make that happen.
Okay?
No, you don't need to stick it in. I'm ready to go.
There you go.
You should be ready to hear it.
Well, while we're doing the audio-visual stuff here, I have a presentation for you that's actually about an hour long, so we'll see if we can do it in 15 or 20 minutes, so we'll have to move kind of quick. But I did want to share one story with you. Now, Tom asked while we were having lunch if we had an organic farm. We use organic methods, but we're not certified organic. And you know, as you farm and as you garden, you learn things. One of the things that I've learned is to reduce water usage. We use natural methods, organic methods. What we do is we plant the rows of onions between the rows of potatoes. So come late July, early August, the plants have matured to the point where the onions make the eyes and the potatoes water and keeps everything wet and growing. So you got to learn these little things. Let's see. So to advance this, I would.
You would push one of the arrows there. See the arrows? Up or down?
Like that. Okay, so that's where we start. So what I want to do briefly is to give you some thoughts about what our experience has been starting a small farm. And what we did was to buy, 10 years ago, I was on the board of a local financial institution. I saw 2008 coming, not to the degree that it actually hit us, but I remember my parents saying that if you have 5 acres, you can make it through anything. So when I had some money to invest, apologies to the stockbrokers in the audience, but I invested in land, and we bought the core, the last 5 acres of an old farm out on Friendly Grove Road, and I thought everybody would be patting us on the back for keeping land in production and in agriculture, and boy, it's been like rolling a rock uphill. But there's been a lot of good stories associated with that. So the question is, what's it like to own a small farm? So I want to mention 5 or 6 things. The first thing is we get a chance to rescue an old farm. This is a farm that has been around since the turn of the century. The Allen family had it from 1921 to 2005 when their son, who had become an elderly man, passed away. That's Mr. Allen there with the horse or the mule. So there's the tradition of carrying on the tradition of farming. We learned a lot about history. This slide alone, I could tell you stories for an hour. But if anybody knows about early development in Olympia, you may recognize Millard Lemon in the lower right. To find out the stories, I had to go back to the land book that was buried in the county courthouse. That's on the lower left, and that goes back to 1854. And the one story I will tell you is that we host the oldest road in the area. It's the old Bigelow Road. It goes back to 1886. It's 20 feet wide and gravel, but it's still doing its job. Another thing about having a small farm is keeping the land in agriculture. Those are the farm workers there in the center with our small tractor. It's also an opportunity to buy a tractor, and it's not just a guy thing either. The women like to run the tractor as well. So we have a hoop house, thanks to, or not a hoop house, but a high tunnel, thanks to USDA NRCS. We have volunteers coming out of the farm, and we have our family that works the farm as well. We also had an opportunity to save an old orchard. It had about a dozen trees. They looked like the wrath of God. They were 70 to 100 years old. I wondered if I should cut them down. I didn't. I'm happy. Some of the trees provide up to half a ton of apples. And we actually have hosted in the lower right seminars by the local Fruit and Nut Society, and also in the middle, you'll see, actually slightly to the left of the middle, you'll see Dave White and his brother Ryan. Because the older apples have a higher tannin content, cider makers like it. Whitewood Cider was a 3-year-old startup, and we provided the first year 40% of the apples of the juice that they use for their cider. It's also an opportunity to work with an uncertain labor force. The picture on the left is what I have on my business card. The picture on the right is what happened right afterwards. And it's also remembering to help others. So this is a photo montage of Kiwanis working the half acre that we fenced in. One of the reasons, the principal reason, was to help the food bank and to bring volunteers out to the farm so we could show them what good stewardship of the land was like, and to build a bridge, to rebuild the bridge actually, between farming and conservation. And the Kiwanis do a great job. If you know Don Leaf, that's him up in the upper left-hand corner. As Larry mentioned, our first year, or the 1 year that we kept track of statistics, we grew on that half acre 4.5 tons of food, and according to the food bank, that helped support 900 families and feed 2,700 people. So small acreage farming is a serious proposition. It's not hobby farming. So, I need some help with a couple of questions, public policy questions that we're currently working on. And so my first question to the audience is, how many of you have some connection with a farm? Maybe you own one, maybe your parents or grandparents, maybe your children or friends. Okay, so there's some experience with farming. So my question is, do we still need local farms? I mean, we can get food that's a lot cheaper, more readily available, greater diversity of choice at Costco and some of the big box stores. Do we need local farms?
Yes.
Yes? Yes? No? Okay. I'm glad we have votes on both sides. But Mr. Balsley, I'm going to remember you raised your hand. Okay, so from a public policy standpoint, the answer is yes. But there's some challenges that I want to alert you to, and that is that too often when people want to save farms, they talk about saving the farmland, they forget the farmer. And this is a problem. It's a little bit like in an urban context, you want to save the storefront, but you forget the merchant and all the things that are required to make downtown business work. And therefore, the admonition here is that farms are businesses too. They need a healthy agricultural economy and a reasonable regulatory environment to support them. Okay, so the question here is then, another question for you is, what is a farm? And that's a question I need some help with. Can anybody throw out an idea about what a farm is? Let's say you're a legislator. and you have to make a decision about this. How do you know a farm when you see it?
Well, I would think a farm would be some place where you would raise product that you would sell to other people as well as yourself. In other words, it can't just be for you, that'd be for other people.
So maybe food, fiber, marijuana,
Sure?
okay?
A product,
And you would add the requirement that you have to sell it,
yes.
okay? Any other thoughts? Is that a farm? Everybody agree? Sir?
It's a great place for your grandchildren to be raised.
Family experience. Okay. Sir, ma'am?
I don't think you necessarily have to sell anything, you have to be basically doing a farm that you're giving to neighbors and stuff. Or
Okay.
have it, that's a community effort, it doesn't necessarily have to be a sales situation.
So,
You can have a home farm without, yeah, sorry.
so you feed yourself, and that would be subsistence farming. And how about giving to the poor? Gleaning has been a tradition in farming for millennia. So when we talk about farming, Ken's right, we're actually talking about commercial farming, but there's also subsistence farming and charitable farming. And then you start talking about size. Does size matter?
No.
No. So little holdings, big holdings, doesn't matter. Anybody disagree? Okay, given the shortness of time, we'll go with that. But these are questions that legislators at all levels of government are dealing with. And the common definition used by USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, is that, well, the common definition is land used for the production of food and fiber, sometimes fuel. The USDA definition is a farm is a place where you can produce up to $1,000 worth of agricultural products or have the potential of producing that. So anybody here who works for the city that's passed urban ag ordinances, you should be mindful of the fact that some of the lots in town under this definition not only qualify as a farm, but also can qualify for federal grants and loans. Interestingly, according to the feds, 1/4 of farms have no sales in a typical year, and at least another 30% have positive sales of less than $10,000. So for legislators that say you really need, if you're going to be a farm, you need to do it full time, that bucks the statistics that are out there. Farms come in lots of different sizes. Urban farms, micro farms, small holdings. People are learning how to regrow food, and they're rediscovering the traditional ways, and they're coming up with new ideas as well. Interestingly, in 21st century agriculture, it's evolving and diversifying rapidly. Small farms now represent the majority of all farms in the U.S. Community agriculture is one of the fastest growing parts of agriculture. And you can see there some of the aspects of what community agriculture is. Selling to hospitals, selling to schools, farmers markets, CSAs, and so forth. But the most important thing about about farms, is the food that they produce. This is actually 12 frames from a medieval manuscript that shows the different months and what you do if you're a farmer back then. So, you know what one of the biggest reasons why food is so important? There you go. That's what we're facing. And if you look at this chart that starts back in 16,000 BC, I don't know when they were taking censuses back then, but that's the chart. It took us up to 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue to get our population up to 500 million. By 1800, it was up to 1 billion. After World War II, after the awful, I think we lost 40 million people in World War II, we still had 2.3 billion people. And since then, in that short time, since then, we are up to 6.5 billion as of 10 years ago. By 2050, they're looking at 9.1 billion. So that's an excellent argument, and there's more than just this, just population growth, about reestablishing our ability to feed ourselves. So not long ago, we used to rely on farms to put food on our table, pretty much up until World War II. And we are again. So this is a trend to pay attention to and to nurture. speaking to Mr. Balsley's point, if you're engaging in commercial farming, a better discussion to have would be to talk about market gardening. This has been around for millennia. And this is usually done on small holdings. It's done with simple tools. It's a commercial proposition you grow for selling to market. But one of the things it's not is hobby farming. That's becoming sort of a swear word with small farmers. Truck farming is another term which you may have heard of, but it shows the evolution of small farming. So when you have people who were farming around the edges of cities back in the 1860s, give or take 10 years, and the railroad came in, they found that they could ship their products to market inside the city and make a lot more money. So technology helped farming along and make more money. The refrigerated car, which came along as a practical proposition about 1900, really aided the transportation of meat and other things. It also really boosted the beer industry. So, why is food important? It's a fundamental value. If you read the history of money, money is representative of value. And one of the most fundamental values down through time has been, your money is worth something if you can buy food with it. That's a good test. It's the foundation of society. If we had more time, I could tell you about some of the histories I've read where our morality, our forms of government, our laws have changed as farming has evolved. The rise of private property starting in the 1500s is a fascinating study. It's the source of community. We all have to eat. It's a wonderful way to help people come together. And most importantly, it's the foundation of our families. How many people here had a mother, an aunt, a grandmother, a friend who baked cookies for you when you were a kid? I had an Aunt Carmela who would scream at me, "Ah, Jimmy, you've only had 7 helpings, you're too skinny, eat some more." And wasn't that love? I mean, food is love. One of the problems we're facing in the public policy sector, however, is the unruly troika. As I've worked with these issues up at the legislature and with local policymakers get started on trying to help local farms, reestablish our local agricultural economy, and they get sidetracked. And the way they get sidetracked is a number of ways, but they start looking at farming and saying, we understand that it's supposed to produce food, but, they should be commercial. If you're not a commercial farm, if you're not a certain size, if you're not this, if you're not that, you're not a farm. If you look at our agritourism ordinance, I think it's 10 acres minimum before you're a real farm. If you look at our critical areas ordinance, I think it's 20 acres. And then they get into a discussion of open space, and this goes back to the problem of saving farmland but not farmers. You have to challenge the policymakers. You want to save your farmland, what? To keep local food production going, or do you just want it for open space to prevent urban sprawl? So it's an excellent discussion. Actually, Riley and I were in a meeting on Tuesday where we spent, the afternoon talking about those things. So our challenge is in dealing with this troika, and a troika is a Russian sleigh with 3 horses, is to encourage our policymakers to take the troika 1 horse at a time and make sure that all 3 pull the sleigh equally. So how do we go about doing this? How do we increase local food production? How do we save local farms and make more? We get organized. We start working together, we build alliances. We designate the lead horse of the troika, which I would recommend would be food production first and foremost. We build a bridge between the gap between agriculture and conservation. It used to be, like I said before, that farmers were good stewards of the land, and since World War II, the gap between agriculture and conservation has grown to the point where many conservationists, or at least too many conservationists, now see farmers as adversaries. We need to also take a look at voluntary stewardship. This is pursuant to a law that was passed in 2011, and Thurston County is one of 2 pilot projects that's putting together a process where we can avoid the acrimony and the litigation that goes with enforcing regulations and look at the goals we're trying to achieve and achieve them voluntarily. Last but not least, look for common interest and emphasize community. Don't let these discussions drive people apart, but rather draw them together. And then you join the revolution. The revolution is to relocalize food and farming, and it's something that benefits all of us. And last but not least, we all have a common interest in supporting local agriculture and food, and that's because we all have to eat. That's something that we should remember. And that's a very brief run-through of this presentation. Before I conclude, I want to recognize Bill McGregor. Bill, where are you? There you are. Anybody else here from the Port of Olympia? And I also want to recognize Riley over here. Bill and the Port, when farmers came to you all 3+ years ago and said, we need your help, we need you to pay attention to local agriculture. Traditionally, the Port of Olympia has helped build infrastructure, the cold storage warehouse, and some of the other things. And we need you to get into that business again, to start building agriculture. That we need to reestablish our farming community. And happily, Bill and his colleagues have treated the issue seriously. And while there's no plans on the book right now, the discussions are moving forward. One of the most exciting things, and this involves Riley, and Riley volunteered for this, is some of us have asked the Port, since the economic surveys that are currently being done here in Thurston County do not include ag in any sort of meaningful way, please work with EDC, please work with the academic sector to make sure that when we're assessing our local economy, you do the merchants and the businesses, and you also take a look at the rural economies and the farmers. So I think that these gentlemen deserve a hand, if you would. So that's a fast run through. I think we're at the end of our time, but if anybody has any questions.
We have time for questions.
Sir.
Having grown up in an agricultural community in eastern Washington, I remember that back then there were so many farms that were 500 or less acres, and now there are 4,000 acre farms prevalent, and I know that is true across the Midwest as too. How does that reconcile with the most farming or small farms?
Eastern Washington farms tend to be more the commodity crops, and what this talk is focused on are the vegetables, really the market gardening, that if you go down to the farmer's market, you're not going to find many commodity crops. You find a few apples and some fruit from Eastern Washington, but otherwise everything's locally grown here, and it tends to be on small holdings. But there's a second answer to your question, and one of the things that the big farmers, there's a farmer that I know in Stevens County, and he runs something called Back Porch Farm. And he, in the presentation I heard him make, he said, we have 800 acres over here. We raise cattle and hay, and we're going bankrupt. And he said, we're going bankrupt until we took 5 acres and cultivated it, put in a high tunnel, and started selling at the local market, and now we're making 6 figures on that. So you're finding the small holding farming creeping into even the big farming enterprises on the east side. So, yes ma'am.
What is the difference between certified and uncertified organic farming?
Okay.
Sorry for my ignorance, I'm a city girl.
I think it's a great question. The organic movement started more or less in the 1970s as a philosophical discussion. It was in reaction to what farmers had adopted starting around World War II, which is better living through chemicals. Chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and so forth. And by the 1970s, there was a reaction. So for a while, it was a philosophical movement. Let's farm without chemical inputs, or at least artificial. And then they went to the legislatures, both national and state, and they embodied the movement in law. So now if you're going to be a, quote, or if you're going to use the word organic farmer, you have to meet a long list of qualifications and be certified by the state. You can't use organic, you probably can't use natural. But what I can tell you is that we grow organically using organic methods, but we're not certified. The nice thing is we can sell you the same pure, unadulterated, locally grown food for considerably less because we don't have all that overhead to get certified. So, thanks to President Greg and for the board for having me.
much for that presentation. It's been very informative. We have a practice of donating to the South Sound Reading Foundation on behalf of our speakers a book that goes to a child. And we try to find books occasionally that relate to the topic. And I found one called Peas Like Carrots. Stuff about potatoes and onions in here and some quizzes. So one of the quizzes or one of the things you learn here is how many, does corn have odd or even typically numbers of rows? You know the answer to that?
Well, you got 50-50 shot, right?
Yeah, we can
No,
guess.
No, believe it or not, it says that an average ear of corn has an even number of rows, which is usually 16. Good book. Some kids don't like that, so I need you to sign this if you would. Right up there. Don't you think that was kind of corny?
Yeah, Greg.
They're gonna pay for that.
Anyway, thanks very much, Jim. Appreciate it. I'm going to get fined. I also have an Aunt Carmela. Had an Aunt Carmela, but I don't think we're related. So you must be Goche is Italian.
It originally was Goche,
Goche?
Romanian. And when Grandpa came through Ellis Island, the Anglos couldn't pronounce it. I don't think he had any teeth at the time anyway.
Let me see that.
And then I'll invite